Why did America ignore the mysterious loss of bombers in Alaska? Why did aircraft full of trained crews vanish into the northern sky and then quietly disappear from the nation's memory? It begins on a route every pilot knew too well, a long, frozen corridor between mainland America and the distant edge of the Cold War. Somewhere over the white emptiness, a bomber checks in with a routine transmission. Weather is rough, instruments are unstable. Then, without warning, the radio falls silent. No distress call, no coordinates. Only absence. Search planes sweep the ice and mountains for days. Reports describe wreckage likely hidden beneath snow and glacier. Files are open, stamped, and closed. In one 1950 case, a U.S. Air Force transport with 4 people aboard vanished after leaving Alaska. Despite one of the largest joint search efforts ever mounted by the U.S. and Canada, no trace has ever been found. Wikipedia boot this wasn't a single freak event. It was part of a pattern. Bombers and military aircraft disappearing in the same unforgiving region, again and again, while official attention seemed to fade almost as quickly as the headlines. What, exactly, was America willing to look away from in Alaska, and why? The night the bombers stopped talking, the first thing that stands out in the archived transcripts is how ordinary the last transmission sounded. No tremor in the pilot's voice. No hint of the cold front rolling over the Aleutians. Just a routine check-in from a bomber cutting through the dark toward the edge of the Arctic. If you read only that final line, you would think the crew had hours ahead of them. But they had minutes. It was late. The kind of late when the human mind begins drifting towards silence. Even while the body stays locked inside the cockpit's metallic hum. The crew had been airborne long enough for the instruments to feel like extensions of their own senses. Outside, the sky was empty, a wide black field with no visible horizon. Below them, Alaska stretched out like a frozen continent the world forgot to finish mapping. Controllers at the base were used to these flights checking in on schedule. Nothing about the bomber's route suggested danger. Nothing on radar hinted at trouble. Yet one tiny detail, a faint crackle layered behind the pilot's voice, made a young radio operator lift his head. He listened again, leaning closer, narrowing his eyes. He almost mentioned it to his supervisor. Almost. Minutes passed. Then the clock hit the moment they were supposed to hear from the bomber again. Nothing. At first, no one panicked. Long-distance flights could drift a few minutes off schedule. Weather created interference. A pause didn't mean disaster. But when the silence stretched a little too long, the supervisor leaned forward and adjusted the dial himself. The static stayed empty. A request was sent. A repeat call. A higher frequency attempt. Still nothing. Only then did someone check the meteorological report that hadn't fully loaded earlier. A tight knot of storms was moving across the corridor, fast, faster than predicted, and buried inside the scattered notes was a line the pilots had never received. A warning about electrical turbulence strong enough to distort navigation readings. The base scrambled for updated radar. Search technicians began tracking the bomber's last known coordinates. The room thickened with tension, though no one said the words everyone was thinking. Military crews avoid that word until the evidence forces it out. They call it loss of contact. Not missing, not gone. Another call went out. Another attempt. The only reply was the steady hiss of an empty channel. What made the room quiet wasn't the silence itself, it was the knowledge that bombers didn't vanish like commercial planes. They were massive, loud, heavily monitored, stuffed with equipment. If one dropped altitude, alarms would fire. If one descended into a storm cell, radar would see it. If something catastrophic happened, anyone should have heard it. Yet this one slipped out of existence as cleanly as if someone had cut its thread. A dispatcher walked over to the map on the wall. He stood inches from it, eyes tracing the bomber's planned route. He marked the last confirmed position with a pin. The next pin stood miles away, untouched. The line between them was only a short distance. But in Alaska, that short distance held more danger than entire nations. A new weather update arrived. The storm had grown worse. Visibility conditions were collapsing, and there was something else buried beneath the top line's reports of strange refractions. In the upper atmosphere, the kind that made radar bend in ways operators didn't always trust. The kind that could hide an aircraft, even from the men watching the screens. Teams were alerted. A search-ready crew was moved into position. But the silence from the bomber had begun to feel heavier, almost deliberate. One lieutenant whispered that maybe the aircraft had diverted. Maybe they'd land at a nearby strip. Maybe someone would call in any moment now with a simple explanation. The supervisor didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the map. By dawn, the search planes were already in the air, cutting through the early light. The men on board scanned the wide expanse below, rivers frozen into stillness, mountains rising like jagged silhouettes, valleys where wind carried the snow in slow spirals. The terrain swallowed sound. It swallowed tracks. It swallowed metal, and somewhere beneath those clouds, a bomber was supposed to be. The first sweep returned nothing. Not a mark on the snow, not a flash of reflection, not a sign of fuel or smoke. The second sweep stretched farther, pushing into the edges of their fuel limits. Still nothing. That was when the search commander requested access to the bomber's classified flight notes, hoping something inside would explain why an aircraft had flown into a growing storm corridor. The reply came back curt, need to know only. His clearance was denied. It didn't make sense. These were the men trying to find the plane. Why deny them information? The commander folded the message and tucked it inside his coat pocket without saying a word. But his crew saw the change in his face, the same question forming behind his eyes that would haunt every disappearance in Alaska for decades. Was the storm the problem? Or was it something the crew never knew they were carrying? Back at the base, the young radio operator replayed the final transmission again and again. Each time, he fixated on the faint crackle in the pilot's voice. He had dismissed it earlier. Now he wondered if he'd missed something larger. He didn't know that the search teams had already begun to suspect the same thing. The crackle wasn't weather. It was an interference. It sounded like a system struggling right before it failed. Hours turned to days. Reports tightened. The official language grew more careful, more restrained. A final line began appearing in memos, presumed down in severe weather. The truth was that no one had seen the bomber go down. No wreckage had been found. No emergency beacon had been heard. There was no physical evidence of anything. Only disappearance. And beneath that disappearance, one detail sat like a needle inside the narrative, small but impossible to ignore. Days after the search was officially suspended, one pilot from a different squadron reported seeing something during his return flight. Through a clear patch of sky. He didn't describe debris. He didn't describe smoke. He mentioned only a shape long, metallic, partly buried in the snow far from where the official search had focused. Before anyone could investigate, another storm rolled through the area. When teams returned later, the shape he described was gone without a trace, swallowed by wind and ice. Months later, the incident was folded into the long list of aircraft lost in Alaska, noted, archived, and forgotten. But the commander kept that denial slip in his coat pocket, and the radio operator kept replaying the crackle in the pilot's voice. And the families kept wondering why the story they received felt unnervingly incomplete. The unanswered part of that night was growing, not shrinking, and soon it would lead investigators to a disturbing pattern that no one wanted to acknowledge, yet one that would become impossible to ignore. Alaska, where planes go silent. First family to receive a letter thought it was a tragic exception. A single plane, a single night, a single set of names folded into careful condolences and formal language. The envelope arrived, with a thud on the kitchen table, heavier than paper should feel. It spoke of service, sacrifice, and severe weather. It did not mention the storm that had moved faster than forecast. It did not mention the denied request for flight notes. It did not mention that no wreckage had been found. At another table, in another town, a different family unfolded almost the same letter. And then another. And another. The pattern didn't announce itself all at once. It came in pieces. A widow who recognized the wording in a neighbor's letter. A father who noticed the same phrasing into separate notifications. A brother who saw the same vague line in the local paper, lost somewhere over Alaska. At the base, the search commander from that first disappearance had begun to notice something else. Each time an aircraft went down in that region, a bomber, a transport, a patrol plane, the explanation looked familiar. Weather, darkness, terrain. Sometimes a mechanical note was added, a faulty instrument, a misread heading. But the map on his wall told a different story. The pins were spreading, not in a neat line along one dangerous corridor, but scattered across a wide swath of wilderness. Some near known storm tracks, others not. Some near radar gaps, some right under coverage. A few vanished in what should have been clear, stable air. He stood in front of the map one evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, and let his eyes blur until the geography faded and only the pins remained. It looked less like random tragedy and more like something else, a quiet bleeding of machines, and lives into a place that never gave them back, far above the frozen rivers and jagged peaks. Alaska's airspace was becoming a place where planes could simply stop being there. If you're watching this and you feel that chill, that sense, that something important is being pushed to the edge of the frame, stay with this story. These are the kinds of mysteries almost no one talks about anymore, but they shape how we trust the stories we're given. If you want to keep uncovering them with us, you already know how to stay connected. Now, back to Alaska. The region itself was a paradox. On the ground, it was brutal, sub-zero winds, sudden whiteouts, mountains that hid in their own shadows. In the air, it was both empty and crowded at the same time. Empty, because you could fly for hours and see nothing but ice, cloud, and the curve of the world. Crowded, because this was the corridor between the continental United States and the northern frontier, a route tied to early Cold War strategy and long-range patrols. Pilots called some stretches of it the blind carters. Radar coverage was patchy, communications inconsistent. Radio signals bounced strangely, sometimes vanishing for minutes, sometimes doubling back with eerie echoes. One crew joked that Alaska didn't like being observed, that the land and sky conspired to pull planes off the map. It was a joke people laughed at only once. In a briefing room lined with faded world maps, the radio operator from that first lost bomber sat across from an investigator sent from higher up. The man's uniform was crisp. His expression was not. He had the look of someone who'd spent a long reading reports that never quite matched reality. "Play the last transmission again," he asked quietly. The operator did. The room filled with the pilot's steady voice, the routine words, the faint underlying crackle. "What do you hear?" the investigator asked. The operator hesitated. "At the time, I thought it was interference," he said. "Now, it sounds like something straining, like equipment pushed past its limit." The investigator nodded. "You're not the first to say that." That single sentence unsettled the operator more than any storm report. Not the first, which meant other crews, other flights, other skies where the last words had sounded calm while the aircraft quietly slipped out of the network. The investigator opened a thin folder. Inside were typed summaries of other incidents. A patrol plane that disappeared on a routine circuit. A bomber that showed a minor instrument glitch before entering a weather system and never reappearing. A transport that checked in normally, then went silent over mountain country. Each report ended the same way, presumed lost due to severe conditions. Each one noted incomplete recovery or no recovery at all. One detail stuck out. In several cases, the last known positions didn't line up perfectly with where the official searches were concentrated. The search perimeters drifted in one direction, as if nudged by something other than pure probability. The investigator circled the discrepancies in pencil, small circles that tightened around an uncomfortable idea, where the search is shaped more by what was practical to admit than by where the missing planes might actually be. Weeks later, the map on the command center wall changed, not with fanfare, not with a formal announcement, just one small adjustment that only the people who stared at it every day would notice. A diagonal line of pins, marking a cluster of disappearances, was quietly removed and redrawn farther northeast, closer to known storm belts. If you asked why, you'd be told the coordinates had been corrected, the data refined, the picture updated. But when the radio operator caught the investigator alone in the corridor, he whispered the question anyway. Why did the map move? The investigator studied him, then looked past him, as if checking who might be listening. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it's easier to blame the storm everyone can see than to question the route no one wants to lose." It was the first hint that something larger was at play than bad luck and bad weather. Alaska wasn't just where planes went silent. It was where silence about those planes seemed to be tolerated. Families began to sense it too. One mother wrote letter after letter asking if her son's bomber had been carrying anything unusual, anything that might have affected the search. The replies were polite and firm. No, routine cargo, standard mission, nothing out of the ordinary. But she had spoken with another family whose son had been on a different flight, also routine, also lost, also over Alaska. Their letter, too, had insisted there was nothing special about the mission. The sameness of the language unnerved her. How could so many flights be ordinary while their endings were anything but? The first serious pushback didn't come from grieving families or base personnel. It came from a pilot who survived. His name never made the headlines, and his official statement was concise, almost bland. But in a closed debriefing, he described something that would trouble investigators for years. He had been flying near one of the carters where multiple disappearances had occurred. Conditions were marginal but manageable, instruments jittery but readable. Then, without warning, his compass spun. Altimeter readings jumped. For a few seconds, he and his co-pilot had no idea which direction they were facing. They fought the urge to trust their instincts over their instruments, leveling the aircraft and holding steady until the readings snapped back into coherence. Later, maintenance crews found no serious fault. The flight was logged as successfully completed, but the pilot's quiet comment at the end of the debrief stuck with everyone in the room. If we'd been half as tired, he said, or a little less lucky, we might have vanished too, and I'm not sure anyone would know why. His report joined the thin stack of documents suggesting that something in Alaska's environment, magnetic anomalies, atmospheric interference, radar blind spots made those skies uniquely unforgiving. And yet, in memo after memo, the tone remained restrained. No urgent directives to reroute flights. No sweeping changes to protocol. Just notes filed and forgotten, while bombers and their crews kept flying the same paths. By now, the pattern was more than coincidence. It was a quiet, growing wound in the records. And then, one winter evening, the investigator received a sealed packet from a contact he hadn't heard from in months. Inside was a copy of a restricted summary from a meeting in which senior officers had discussed acceptable operational losses along the northern corridor. Alaska's airspace, the document suggested, was considered critical enough that even a series of unexplained disappearances would not justify major changes, at least not publicly. Near the end of the summary, one line stood by itself. Further, inquiry into anomalous incidents not recommended at this time. The investigator stared at those words for a long time. Outside, the wind scraped across the hangars, carrying the howl of another incoming storm. Somewhere out on those frozen routes, more aircraft were in the air, riding the edge between known and unknown. He folded the document slowly, aware that he was holding the first real proof that the mystery of the missing bombers in Alaska wasn't just about nature or fate or bad luck. It was also about what people in power chose not to look at. What he did with that proof and who tried to stop him would shape everything that came next. The official version, the meeting room, was colder than it needed to be. The investigator noticed that first. A long wooden table stood under humming lights, and the officers gathered around it with the same expression, composed, distant, already settled into a conclusion they hadn't yet spoken aloud. He took his seat quietly, aware that he wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to listen. A colonel from the operations division cleared his throat and began reading from a prepared summary. The language was clean, tight, polished, every sentence shaped like a wall meant to keep doubt outside. According to the official version, the missing bombers were victims of harsh Arctic weather, unpredictable atmospheric distortions, and expected operational risk. The phrase repeated itself so often that it stopped sounding strange. Expected, operational, risk, as if vanishing into the snow was already part of the plan. The investigator watched the colonel's eyes. They remained steady, never lifting from the page. But one detail broke the rhythm, a pause so slight most in the room wouldn't notice it right. Before he read the line about the bomber that had disappeared on a night when the skies had actually been clear. The pause was brief, but it cracked open something the investigator had suspected for weeks. Even the man delivering the explanation didn't fully believe it. When the meeting adjourned, he stayed behind, pretending to straighten his notes while others filed out. A folder containing the latest public credit narrative lay on the table. He opened it slowly, scanning the phrases crafted to ease families into acceptance. Sudden loss of altitude, probable weather-induced navigational error, incomplete recovery due to terrain, each wording softer than the one before it, as if the truth could be sanded down until no one questioned it anymore. He read one line twice, no indication of unusual equipment behavior. He knew that wasn't true. Crewmen from other flights had reported flickering instruments. One had described a compass that spun uncontrollably. Another mentioned a moment of complete radio blackout in clear conditions, but none of those accounts had found their way into the official summaries. Outside, a plane was warming on the runway. Its engines rumbled through the walls, a steady vibration that reminded him of the aircraft's still missing bombers, whose engines had rumbled just like this before fading into silence. A few days later, he was called to speak with a general whose reputation for blunt efficiency was well known. The general sat behind a wide metal desk, hands clasped, posture rigid. A man used to command, used to answers, used to control. "We appreciate your work," the general began, "but your investigation is drifting into areas beyond your scope." The investigator waited, not trusting himself to speak yet. "You've been interviewing personnel outside your assignment," the general continued, "asking about equipment failures, radar blind zones, flight paths. That's not your directive. My directive," the investigator said carefully, "is to understand why so many aircraft have vanished without explanation." The general's gaze didn't waver. "The explanation is weather." The investigator set the sealed summary on the desk, the one mentioning acceptable losses, the one advising against further inquiry, and slid it forward a few inches. The general didn't look down. "That document," the investigator said, "confirms that we knew these corridors held risks we didn't publicly acknowledge, and we kept sending crews anyway, even after anomalies were reported." The general exhaled slowly, a controlled release of irritation. "You're treading into political territory. Alaska is strategically essential. Routes must remain open. Public confidence must remain intact. There are times when operational necessity outweighs full transparency." The room felt suddenly smaller. "And the families?" the investigator asked quietly. "How much do they get to know?" "As much as is helpful," the general replied. The words settled between them like frost. When the investigator left the office, he stepped into a hallway where an elderly janitor was sweeping slowly, humming a tune lost beneath the echoing steps of passing officers. The investigator stopped for a moment. He needed a place to think, but the hallway itself was whispering something he'd been trying to avoid. That the official version wasn't just an explanation, it was a shield. He spent the next weeks combing through archived logs, radio recordings, and weather maps. Patterns emerged. A bomber that vanished in mild conditions. A transport that reported strange interference moments before silence. A patrol flight whose last radar return flickered, then vanished as if swallowed by the terrain. Then came the report that changed everything. A civilian bush pilot, flying a mail route near the edge of one of the disappearance corridors, had reported seeing something unusual. Not debris, not smoke, something stranger. A series of metallic flashes along a ridge, as if something large and partly buried was reflecting the brief morning light. His statement never made it to the press. It was filed, reviewed, and then quietly sent to the restricted archives. The investigator drove to the airstrip to speak with the man personally. The pilot was tall, weathered, with a voice roughened by years of shouting over engine noise. He led the investigator into a hangar where an old heater hummed, and stacks of gear filled the corners. "I wasn't supposed to talk about that again," the pilot said, pulling off his gloves. "But since you're here, I'll tell you exactly what I saw." He described flying low over a valley of broken stone and hard-packed snow. The light was dim, clouds shifting overhead. Then the sun broke through for a moment, and he saw at a long metallic surface, curved, unnatural against the jagged earth. Not a wing, not a fuselage, not anything he recognized at first glance. "When I circled back 5 minutes later," he said, "the light was gone. Storm rolled in. Couldn't see anything." "Did anyone search the area?" the investigator asked. The pilot shook his head slowly. "They searched where they wanted to search." The words chilled the investigator more than a draft drifting through the hangar door. He thanked the pilot and stepped back into the gray afternoon. Snow was falling lightly, drifting toward the runway, softening every edge. He stood there for a long time, watching the white accumulate on the ground, thinking of all the planes that had vanished exactly like that, bit by bit, layer by layer, until even memory struggled to find them. That night, he reviewed the official statements again, reading them under the dim glow of his desk lamp. The words seemed different now, like a carefully rehearsed performance rather than a report. He could hear the absence in them, the things left unsaid, the details trimmed away, the uncertainties buried beneath certainty. He knew the next step in his investigation would take him somewhere the official version didn't want him to go. Not north, not into the mountains, but into the documents that had shaped the narrative. Classified communications, internal memos, reports filed in the shadows. Just before midnight, he received an unexpected knock at his door. A young mechanic from the base stood there, eyes uneasy, hands shoved into the pockets of a grease-stained jacket. "I shouldn't be here," the mechanic said softly, "but I heard you're looking into the disappearances." The investigator waited. "There's something you need to see," the mechanic whispered. "Something the maintenance team found on a plane that made it back. One that flew the same route as the bomber that disappeared." "What did you find?" the investigator asked. The mechanic hesitated, staring at the floor as if the truth itself might crack it open. It wasn't damage, he said. It was interference. Something we couldn't explain. Not weather. Not mechanical. Not electrical failure. Something else. The investigator leaned forward. Where is it now? The mechanic swallowed hard, then answered with a word that made the investigator feel the room tilt slightly around him. Gone. The mechanic stepped back into the night, leaving the investigator alone with a new piece of the puzzle, one that didn't fit anywhere. In the official version, and somewhere in the frozen corridors of Alaska, another plane was preparing for takeoff, unaware that its route lay directly across the silence waiting to swallow it next. What wasn't meant to be found, the mechanic's footsteps faded into the dark, but the investigator didn't move, not at first. Something inside him felt as if it had shifted, as if the ground beneath this investigation had been slightly tilted the entire time, and he was only now feeling it. The word gone kept repeating itself in the cold hallway air, its meaning too sharp to ignore. Inside the maintenance hangar, a plane sat under half-lit lamps. The investigator had walked past it 100 times. Tonight it felt different, like a witness that had been waiting for someone willing to ask questions no one else dared to ask. He approached it slowly, the smell of fuel and old metal hanging heavy in the air. A senior crew chief emerged from behind the wing, wiping his hands on a rag. He froze when he saw who it was. You're not supposed to be here at this hour, the chief said. I need to know what your team found, the investigator answered. The chief hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the far corner of the hangar toward a space where equipment crates once sat, crates that were now conspicuously absent. You're asking about something that was taken before we could even write a full report, the chief said. We logged an anomaly. That's all we were allowed to keep. What kind of anomaly? The chief lowered his voice. The plane was clean when it left the ground, but when it came back, there were scorch marks along the inner fuselage. Not from fire, not from heat. They were patterned, like something electromagnetic had passed through the structure. The investigator felt a cold pressure building in his chest. And the evidence? A team came in at dawn, the chief murmured. Said they were from a different division. They took the panels, the wiring, even the bolts, everything that showed the marks, and left no record of who they were. The chief gave a hollow, bitter smile. That's how you know it's real. A gust of wind rattled the hangar doors. Somewhere outside, a generator coughed back to life. The investigator walked around the aircraft, trailing his fingers along the cool metal skin. The new paint couldn't hide the faint distortion beneath it, a subtle ripple, where something had once seared through. Did the crew report anything unusual during the flight? He asked. Nothing they put in writing. The chief folded the rag slowly. But the co-pilot said something strange. Said the instruments didn't just glitch. Said they were being pushed, like a force was leaning on the plane. The investigator's breath froze in his throat. Pushed from where? Above, the chief whispered. Or below, or maybe both. He couldn't tell. There were moments in an investigation when everything suddenly felt too quiet, too still, as if the truth itself was pausing to see whether you keep going. This was one of those moments. The next morning, the investigator drove into town under a sky thick with low-grade clouds. He needed to speak to someone far from the base, someone who wouldn't be monitored. The civilian pilot from days earlier had agreed to meet him again, this time in a small diner near the cold edge of the harbor. The diner was nearly empty. A radio played faintly in the corner. Coffee steamed on the tables. The pilot sat in a booth with a worn jacket and tired eyes. You look like a man who found something he wishes he didn't, the pilot said. I found something that shouldn't have been hidden, the investigator replied. The pilot leaned in. Then you're getting close to the part of the story people stopped talking about. What part is that? The pilot looked out the window. Snow drifted across the street in thin, swirling sheets. There are places in Alaska where compasses twitch even on clear days, he said. Places where radios pick up voices that aren't there. Places where the air feels heavy, like a storm that never arrives. Magnetic anomalies. The investigator murmured. Some of them, sure, the pilot said, but not all. The investigator waited. 2 years ago, the pilot continued, one of our planes flying cargo took a strange hit of interference. We lost altitude fast. I thought we were going into the ridge. But then everything snapped back, like nothing had happened. When we landed, the tower told us there'd been no radar disturbance at all. And you think these anomalies are connected to the missing bombers? I think they're connected to something no one can explain. And that scares the people who are supposed to be in charge. The investigator leaned back, his mind racing through the cases. the crackles in the final transmissions, the compass spinning on the patrol plane, the civilian sighting along the ridge, the maintenance interference, the missing evidence. Something wasn't adding up because something wasn't supposed to. When he returned to the base, he found a sealed envelope waiting for him in his office. No name, no signature. Inside was a single sheet of carbon-copied paper, an old search log from a vanished bomber. Half the lines were blacked out, but one entry near the bottom had survived the censor's pen. It read, "Unconfirmed audio received at 0:13 hours. Possible transmission. We're not alone in this. Origin unclear." The investigator stared at the line, rereading it until the letters almost blurred. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't even certain. But it was real. Someone, somewhere, at some point in the night one bomber disappeared, had heard those words. The knock on his door came softly. A communications officer stepped inside, her expression troubled. "Sir," she said carefully, "I don't know how'd you got that log, but you need to be careful. Some of the men upstairs think you're stirring unrest." "I'm following the evidence," he replied. "Some evidence isn't meant to be followed." She hesitated, then added, "Something else came across the channels today." He looked up sharply. "What?" "A weather monitoring station in the far north reported a brief radar contact just before dawn. Large object, slow-moving, no transponder. It appeared for 6 seconds and vanished. Aircraft? Not one of ours. Not one of theirs. Not one anyone can identify." He waited. "And its location?" A silence stretched between them. "Close," she whispered. "The close to where the first bomber vanished." The investigator felt something slide coldly through his chest, part fear, part realization. Whatever had been happening in the skies over Alaska, it wasn't over. The communications officer moved toward the door. "There's talk of grounding flights," she said, "but it won't happen. Not officially. Not unless someone forces them to confront what they don't want to admit." "And what is that?" he asked. She met his eyes. "That something out there is affecting our aircraft, and we have no idea what it is." Her footsteps disappeared down the corridor. The investigator sat alone, staring at the message on his desk. "We're not alone in this." For the first time since the disappearances began, he felt a new question rising, not about what was happening in Alaska, but why America seemed strangely willing to pretend nothing was happening at all. And somewhere beyond the windows, in the frozen, shifting sky, a silent echo moved through the clouds as another bomber prepared for his night flight into the corridor, where answers were never guaranteed to return. The silence above the ice, the storm arrived without warning, one of those sudden, heavy northern tempests that seemed to materialize out of the very air. Wind slammed against the hangars, rattling the metal sheets until they moaned. Snow swept across the runway like pale smoke. The sky collapsed into a single shifting mass of gray. The investigator watched it from the control tower, his breath fogging the cold glass. Somewhere beyond that wall of white, the last clues of the first bomber's disappearance were hidden. The ridge the civilian pilot had described, the stretch of valley where radar contacts flickered, the air corridor where compasses spun and radios hissed with impossible messages. Tonight, another bomber was scheduled to pass through that same corridor. A crew of 8, experienced, calm, some of them young enough to believe the sky could be reasoned with, all of them unaware of the anomalies that had been brushed out of the official reports. The investigator grabbed his coat and hurried down the tower steps. He moved through the corridors, the storms were pressing against the walls. He found the communications officer, the one who had warned him, standing alone, with a stack of printouts. "They're still sending that crew out," she said. "They won't delay the mission. They don't want anyone thinking the corridor is unsafe. It is unsafe. Not officially." The investigator took a breath. "Patch me through to their pre-flight brief. I need to warn them about the interference patterns. They won't listen. If you tell them what you know, they'll say you're undermining the chain of command. Let them." His voice was steady. "I'm not trying to stop the mission. I just want them to understand what they're flying into." The officer hesitated, then nodded. She opened the channel. The crew's voices filtered through, lighthearted, almost casual. Someone joked about the weather, another about the coffee. The investigator waited until the noise settled. "This is special inquiry," he said. "Before you take off, I need to inform you of prior anomalies reported on your assigned route." Silence. The pilot finally spoke. "Sir, we've been given the official risk assessment. Weather, no more. That assessment left things out." Another voice cut in. "Sir, with respect, are we being reassigned?" "No. the investigator said. But your instruments may behave unpredictably. Compasses have spun. Radios have gone dead. Some aircraft have returned with structural anomalies. If anything feels wrong, trust that instinct. Don't assume it's the storm. A few tense seconds passed. The pilot's voice returned, quieter now. Understood. The channel closed. The investigator stepped away from the console, knowing he had likely violated protocol. But he also knew he'd done the only thing he could. The storm outside hammered the base harder, wind howling like distant engines. The night pressed in, thick and cold. Hours later, long after he'd paced every hallway twice, the bomber lifted into the air. Its engines thundered across the base, banking north toward the corridor where so many had disappeared. The investigator stood at the edge of the runway, coat flapping, snow biting his face. He watched the aircraft rise until it vanished into the storm. The communications officer joined him. If anything happens, she murmured, they'll blame us. They can blame me. She looked at him. You think this is about blame? No. He didn't. He thought it was about a truth no one wanted to confront. Back inside the operations room, the storm's interference made every console flicker. Technicians leaned over their screens, squinting into static. The investigator remained behind them, listening to each transmission. At first, everything was routine, turbulence, altitude adjustments, a minor course correction. Then came a pause, a long one. Static crept into the channel, thin at first, then tightening like a wire pulled taut. The pilot's voice finally returned. Control, instruments fluctuating. Trying to stabilize, the static thickened. The lights flickered. Snow slammed against the windows in violent bursts. Control, we're getting. The transmission broke. The investigator stepped closer to the radio set, heart pounding. Say again. A burst of static, louder this time, surged through the room. Then, not reading altitude. Adjusting. The co-pilot's voice cut through necks, strained, breathless. Something's hitting our field readings. Never seen this before. The technicians exchanged looks. None of them had heard anything like it, not even in the earlier disappearances. The investigator felt the room closing around him. Pilot, listen to me, he said, leaning over the console. Hold altitude. Ignore the compass. Use horizon line only. If we could see the horizon, that'd be great. The pilot snapped, half panicked, half trying to keep humor alive. The storm swallowed their laughter. Another jolt of interference ripped through the audio. For a moment, the only sound was a strange low hum like metal vibrating under immense pressure. Control, we're losing. Then silence. Not the chaotic silence of static. Not the fractured silence of a broken connection. A clean, flat, empty silence. A silence identical to the one from the first bomber. Technicians scrambled, switching frequencies. Someone shouted for backup channels. Someone else grabbed the weather maps. The pressurized air inside the operations room felt suffocating. The investigator closed his eyes. Not again. Not while he was listening. Then faint, distant, buried under the static, a voice. We see something. The room froze. Say again, the investigator whispered. Light, not lightning. Hovering. Static surged, swallowing half the words. Moving with us. Matching speed. A second voice broke and shaking, on the edge of fear. It's above us, no. Below can't tell. Another burst of interference drowned them out. When the channel cleared, their tone had changed. Tighter, lower. Dread pressing into every syllable. Instruments gone. Compass spinning. Something's pulling, and then, a single sharp sound. Not an explosion. Not a crash. More like the sudden collapse of pressure, a violent vacuum pulling everything inward. Then letting go. Silence returned. Total. Absolute. Final. The room erupted into motion. Officers barked orders. Technicians ran to radar. A scramble team was dispatched despite the storm. But the investigator remained still, staring at the console, waiting for even one more whisper from the crew. None came. Minutes stretched. Then an operator gasped. Sir, radar contact. Brief. Same region. Same pattern as before. The investigator leaned over the screen. A faint blip appeared for a second. A large object, slow-moving, undefined. It drifted across the radar sweep and vanished. The same signature from the previous dawn. The same silent presence hovering above the ice. The same unexplained shadow that seemed to appear whenever a bomber fell off the map. The investigator felt the truth settle deep into him, not an answer, but the weight of a question too large to hide anymore. Whatever was happening in Alaska, it had just happened again, and this time, he had heard every second of it. Now he had to decide what to do next, tell the world, or disappear like the bombers that had dared to fly into the silence.